My name is Sera Whitfield, and I was 31 years old when I came home from my honeymoon to find my mother-in-law asleep in my bed. Not the guest room, not the couch, my bed. The one my husband and I had picked out together 6 months before the wedding. The one I had spent 3 weeks finding the right linen for. The one that was supposed to be ours. Her suitcases were open on my side of the room. Her reading glasses were on my nightstand. Her cardigan was folded over my pillow like she had been there for years and expected to stay for several more. My husband, Daniel, stood in the doorway behind me and said in a voice that I will never forget for the rest of my life, well, she had nowhere else to go. I did not scream. I did not cry. I set my carry-on down in the hallway with both hands, very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are shaking and you do not want anyone to see it. Then I turned to look at my husband of 11 days, and I said, "We are going to need to talk." He nodded like that was reasonable, like this was a reasonable situation, like a woman finding her mother-in-law installed in her marital bedroom 11 days into her marriage was something that happened and was worked through with a calm conversation over tea. Before I tell you how this ends, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love knowing where you are when you listen to this. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. I met Daniel Whitfield at a work conference in the spring, 3 years before any of this. He was presenting a session on project management, and I was in the back row with a coffee that had gone cold and a notebook I was only half using. He was good at it, clear, organized, the kind of person who makes complex things sound simple without making you feel simple for not having understood them before. I introduced myself afterward, and he looked at me with the focused attention of someone who was actually interested in what came next and not already thinking about the next thing. We dated for 8 months before he told me about his mother, not because he was hiding her, because, he said, she was complicated, and he wanted me to know him before I knew her. I thought that was considerate. I thought it showed self-awareness. I have since revised that interpretation. Patricia Whitfield was 63, recently widowed, and lived 40 minutes away in the house Daniel had grown up in. She was sharp and well-dressed, and had the particular manner of a woman who had spent decades being the most important person in a room, and had never quite adjusted to rooms where that was not automatically true. She was not cruel, she was precise, and precision, I have learned, can be its own variety of cruelty when it is pointed in the wrong direction.
Daniel's father had passed 18 months before I met Daniel. Heart attack, sudden, the kind that gives no warning and asks no permission. Daniel had taken it hard, in the quiet way of men who take things hard, without letting you see the weight of it. What I understand now, that I did not understand then, is that his father's death had done something to the architecture of his family. It had removed the one person who had always stood between Daniel and his mother's needs. His father had been the buffer, the person who absorbed Patricia's demands before they reached Daniel, the person who redirected her energy and managed her expectations and made sure the household ran without Daniel having to carry it. When his father died, that role did not disappear. It transferred. Daniel did not choose it consciously. I do not think he even knew it had happened. But by the time I met him, he had been his mother's primary emotional support, errand runner, decision maker, and first phone call for a year and a half. He thought this was normal. He thought this was love. Those two things are not always the same, and learning the difference is one of the harder lessons a person can be handed. We got engaged on a Saturday morning in February. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I want to be honest about that. I loved him. I love him still, though love has looked different at different points in this story. The engagement period was when I first started keeping a file, not a physical one, not yet, just a mental catalogue of moments I noticed and set aside and did not know what to do with. Patricia calling Daniel twice during our engagement dinner to ask about a noise her furnace was making. Patricia arriving at our apartment unannounced on a Sunday with a casserole and staying for 4 hours. Patricia expressing at our first wedding venue visit that the location was lovely, but perhaps a little far for her to drive comfortably, and could we consider something closer to her side of the city. Daniel adjusting the venue shortlist without telling me. I noticed. I said something once, quietly, about the venue, and Daniel said his mother had had a hard year, and it cost nothing to be considerate. I let it go. I told myself this was a season, that once the wedding was done and we were settled, the pattern would shift. People tell themselves this. It is one of the most common stories a person tells themselves, and one of the least often true. The wedding itself was beautiful, I want to say that clearly, because it was. The flowers were right, and the light was right, and when Daniel looked at me at the end of the aisle, he looked at me the way he had looked at me that first day in the conference room, with the full weight of his attention pointed in my direction. Patricia sat in the front row and cried, which I thought was love, and was probably also something else. We left for our honeymoon the morning after the wedding, 2 weeks in Portugal, planned for 8 months, paid for carefully because neither of us had money to waste, and both of us had worked extra hours to make it possible. I had wanted this trip since I was 22 years old. The specific light in Lisbon, the tiles, the food, the particular feeling of being somewhere ancient and unhurried with someone you love. We landed and the air smelled like salt and old stone, and I felt for the first time in a year of planning and organizing other people's feelings about our wedding completely at ease. I did not check my phone that first evening. Daniel checked his twice at dinner, and I did not say anything because I was choosing peace, and because I trusted that whatever it was manageable. On day 3 I noticed he was checking it more. On day 5 he took a call outside the restaurant and was gone for 20 minutes. He came back and said his mother was having a hard time adjusting. I said adjusting to what? He said being alone. I said she has been alone for 18 months. He said this is different. I asked how. He changed the subject. On day 7 he told me his mother had mentioned that her sister, who she usually spent time with, was travelling and that she was finding the empty house difficult. I said I was sorry to hear that. I meant it. I did not know yet that the conversation had already moved past sympathy into logistics. I found out on day 9. We were in the Algarve, on a terrace above the ocean, and Daniel's phone rang and he answered it, and I watched his face do the thing it did when he was managing something he had not yet decided how to tell me. He spoke quietly for about 6 minutes. Then he hung up and he set the phone down and he looked at me with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is now working out how to present it as something other than it is. He said, "I need to tell you something." I said, "Okay." He said, "I talked to my mother yesterday and she's been really struggling, and I told her it would be okay if she stayed at the house for a little while we're still away, just so she's not alone." I looked at him across the table with the ocean behind him and the sun going down, and I said, "You gave her a key to our house." He said, "She had a spare from when she helped us move in." I said, "And you told her she could stay?" He said, "Just temporarily." I said, "Daniel, we are on our honeymoon." He said, I know, Sera. She just needed somewhere to go." I want to tell you that I handled the next few minutes well. I want to tell you I was calm and measured and said exactly the right things.
What I actually did was put my wine glass down and look at the ocean for a long time and breathe in and breathe out and decide that this conversation was not over, but that I was not going to finish it on a terrace in Portugal while it was still beautiful outside.
We did not fight about it that night. This was not grace on my part, it was strategy. I had learned early in my life that the worst time to have an important conversation is when your emotions are in the room, louder than your words. I went to bed, and I lay in the dark, and I thought about what had just happened, with the precision of someone who works in contract management for a living, and understands that the terms of an agreement matter, and that allowing a term to be changed without discussion sets a precedent that is very difficult to undo. My husband had given another person access to our home during our honeymoon without asking me. He had done it unilaterally. He had done it and then waited 2 days to tell me. And he had framed it as a kindness, which it was, but it was a kindness extended using a resource that was not solely his to offer. Our home was not his mother's hotel. Our honeymoon was not the appropriate window for making housing arrangements, and the fact that he had waited until day 9 to tell me meant that he had known on day 7, and possibly earlier, and had chosen his moment carefully, which was not the behaviour of a man who thought he had done nothing wrong. It was the behaviour of a man who knew exactly what he had done and had calculated the best time to present it. I did not sleep well. In the morning I ordered good coffee and I said, "We need to finish the conversation from last night." He nodded. He looked tired. I think he had not slept well either. I told him 3 things. I told him that I understood his mother was struggling and that I was not without sympathy for that. I told him that the decision to allow her into our home during our honeymoon was not his to make alone, and that making it without me was a breach of the agreement we had made when we got married, which was that we were a unit now, and that unit made decisions together. And I told him that when we got home, there needed to be a clear and specific plan for how long his mother was staying and what the boundaries of that arrangement were, and that I needed to be part of making that plan, not informed of it after the fact. He listened. He said I was right. He said he should have asked me. He said he was sorry. He meant it. I could see that he meant it, and I accepted it. What I did not account for was the gap between a man meaning something and a man being able to act on what he means when his mother is the counterweight. We spent the last 3 days of the honeymoon quietly, not unhappily. We still walked the city and ate the food and sat by the water and laughed. But something had shifted, and we both knew it, and neither of us said so because we were still on our honeymoon, and some things you protect until you are ready to look at them directly. I was not ready yet. I would be ready soon. We landed home on a Tuesday afternoon. The drive from the airport took 40 minutes. Daniel was quiet. I was quiet. The house is a 3-bedroom on a quiet street that we had moved into 6 months before the wedding, that I had spent months making feel like a home, that had my books on the shelves and my plants on the windowsills, and the specific arrangement of things that tells you a space belongs to someone. We pulled into the driveway and I noticed a second car parked along the curb that I did not recognize. We walked to the front door. Daniel used his key. The house smelled of a different cleaning product than the one I use. I noticed that first. Then I noticed the coat on the hook by the door that was not mine. Then I noticed the shoes on the mat that were not mine. Then I followed Daniel up the stairs and down the hall, and he pushed open the bedroom door, and Patricia was asleep in our bed, with her reading glasses on the nightstand, and her cardigan on my pillow, and her suitcase open on my side of the room. And Daniel said, well, she had nowhere else to go. And I set my bag down carefully in the hallway, and I told him we needed to talk. I want to pause here for a moment, because I want you to understand what it felt like to stand in that hallway. I had been married for 11 days. I had been in Portugal for 11 days. I had come home to my house, which was also my marriage, and found it occupied by someone else while my husband stood behind me and explained it as though it made sense.
We had the conversation in the kitchen. Patricia was still asleep. Daniel sat across from me at the table where we had eaten 100 meals in the 6 months before the wedding, and I looked at him and said, "I need to understand what the plan is." He said, "She just needs a few weeks." I said, "A few weeks where, Daniel?" "In our bedroom." He said, "I thought she would be more comfortable in there." I said, "And where did you think I would be?" He looked at the table. He said we could use the guest room. I want to be fair about what happened next, because Daniel is not a bad man, and I knew that then, and I know it now. He is a man who had been trained his entire life to absorb his mother's distress and neutralize it as quickly as possible at whatever cost was available, and the cost he had reached for this time was mine. He had not thought it through past the immediate relief of his mother not being upset. He had not, in any meaningful sense, considered me at all. And when I said that to him, quietly, without accusation, just as a fact, his face did the thing I had never seen it do before. It crumpled. Not dramatically, just a small internal collapse. The expression of a man who has been handed a mirror and does not like what he sees in it. I said, "I am not going to sleep in the guest room of my own house, Daniel." He said, I know, Sarah." I said, "So what happens now?"
What happened next was 3 days of nothing changing. Patricia came downstairs the morning after we arrived home and greeted me with the warmth of someone who had done nothing unusual and expected to be treated accordingly. She made tea in my kitchen. She asked about Portugal. She sat at my table and talked about her sister's trip and her furnace and a television program she had been watching, and she spoke about the house in the easy, proprietary way of someone who had decided it was also hers. Daniel moved around her like a satellite in her orbit, deferring, softening, preemptively managing her mood before it had a chance to form into anything that would require him to address it. I watched this for 3 days, and I said nothing because I was still deciding. On the 3rd evening, I called my mother, not to complain, to think out loud with someone who knew me well enough to ask the right questions. She listened for a long time, and then she said, "Sarah, what do you actually want?" I said, "I want my husband to choose me." She said, "Has he been given the real chance to make that choice?" I said, "I have told him clearly what I need." She said, "Telling is not the same as choosing. A choice requires a moment where the cost of both options is fully visible to the person making it. You have told him what you need, you have not yet built the moment where he has to actually decide." I sat with that for the rest of the evening. My mother says very little. She means all of it. On the 4th night, I asked Daniel to sit with me after Patricia had gone to bed. I made tea, I put it in front of him, and I sat across from him, and I did not open with anything soft, because soft had not been producing results. I said, "I need to tell you exactly where I am, and I need you to hear it without explaining or defending until I am finished." He said, "Okay." I said, "I have been home for 4 days, and I have felt like a guest in my own house every single one of them. I have watched you manage your mother's comfort at the direct and consistent expense of mine, and I do not believe you have noticed you were doing it. I am not asking you to stop loving your mother. I am asking you to remember that you married me." I said, "There needs to be a date, a specific date, not a few weeks, not when she feels ready, a real calendared date by which Patricia has returned to her own home and made her own arrangements. And that date needs to come from you, said directly and clearly to her without me having to ask you again." He said, "She is not going to like it." I said, "I know." He said, "She is going to be very upset." I said, "I know that too." And then I said the sentence I had been building toward for 4 days. I said, "Daniel, I need to know if you are capable of disappointing your mother in order to protect your marriage, because if the answer is no, that is something I need to know now while I can still do something about it." He did not answer that night. He said he needed to think, and I said that was fair, because it was a real question, and real questions deserve real time, and not answers produced under pressure that dissolve the moment the pressure is removed. I went to the guest room because Patricia was still in our bed, and I lay in the narrow bed in the dark, and I thought about my mother's question again. What do you actually want? I wanted my husband. I wanted the man I had watched present a session on project management in a conference room and thought, that one, without hesitation. I wanted the man who had proposed on a Tuesday because he said he could not wait until the weekend. I wanted the life we had planned, which was specific and real, and had nothing in it about a mother-in-law in our bedroom while we tried to have a marriage in the guest room. And I wanted to know, before I made any further decisions about what to do next, whether Daniel wanted those things too, or whether he wanted them in theory, but would always, in practice, choose the path of least resistance the moment his mother applied any pressure at all. I did not sleep easily. When I finally did, I dreamed about Portugal, the terrace above the ocean, the moment just before he told me, when everything was exactly the shape it was supposed to be. I woke up before the alarm, and I was still in the guest room, and Patricia was still down the hall, and Daniel had not come to find me, and I understood that today was going to be the day things either changed or did not. Daniel came to find me the next morning before Patricia was awake. He sat on the edge of the guest bed, and he looked at me, and he said, "I have been thinking about what you asked me." I said, "Okay." He said, "I think I have been doing something for a long time that I did not have a name for until last night." He said, "I have been treating my mother's discomfort as my emergency. Every time she was unhappy, I responded like it was something that needed to be fixed immediately, at whatever cost was available to me, and I never stopped to think about what it was costing, because fixing it felt like the right thing, and I did not look past the feeling to examine it." He said, "I did not think about you in those moments, and that's the part I am most ashamed of." He said this quietly, with the particular quality of a man who actually sat with something overnight and not just found the words he thought would produce the result he wanted. I know the difference. I've had enough conversations in my professional life to recognize when someone is performing understanding versus actually arriving at it. Daniel was arriving at it. It was slower than I would have wanted. It had taken more than it should have, but it was real, and real, even when it is late, is better than the performance of it offered on time. I said, "Okay." I said, "So what are you going to do?" He said, "I am going to talk to her today. I am going to give her a gate."
He talked to Patricia that afternoon. I was not in the room. I had offered to be, and he had said he needed to do this part alone, which I respected because it was the right instinct. A man who asks his wife to deliver difficult news to his mother has not actually done the work. He has just redistributed it. Daniel went into the living room where Patricia was reading and closed the door halfway, and I sat in the kitchen, and I could hear the tone of the conversation without the words, the way you can hear weather without seeing it. Patricia's voice rose twice. Daniel's stayed level both times. That was new. That was the first genuinely new thing I had seen from him since we got home. After about 20 minutes, Daniel came back into the kitchen and sat down and said, "I told her she needs to go home by the end of next week, 10 days. I said, "How did she take it?" He said, "She said I was choosing you over her." I waited. He said, "I told her that was not how I thought about it. I told her I was choosing my marriage, which is what I'm supposed to do, and that it was not a rejection of her, but a definition of what our home is and who it belongs to." He said this looking at the table, and I let him finish, and then I said, "Daniel." He looked up. I said, "That was the right thing." He said, "I know. It did not feel good." I said, "It is not supposed to feel good. It is supposed to be true."
Patricia did not speak to me for the remaining 10 days. She was present at meals, she responded when addressed, but she directed everything through Daniel and treated me with the elaborate courtesy of someone who has decided to make their displeasure known through the performance of politeness rather than through anything that could be directly addressed. I recognized the tactic. I had seen versions of it in professional settings, the pointed civility of someone who wants you to know they are unhappy without giving you anything concrete to respond to. I did not take the bait. I was pleasant. I was consistent. I did not adjust my behavior to accommodate her mood, because adjusting my behavior to accommodate her mood was how we had arrived at this situation in the first place. On the third day of the silent treatment, Patricia went to Daniel and told him she felt unwelcome in the house. Daniel came to me and told me what she had said. I said, "What did you tell her?" He said, "I told her that this is Sera's home and that Sera has been nothing but gracious, and feeling unwelcome and being made unwelcome are two different things." I looked at him for a moment. He had said it without prompting. He had said it because it was true, and because he had decided that truth was the currency he was going to use now, regardless of the cost. I said, "Thank you." He said, "I should have been saying things like that a long time ago." He was right. He was right, and I did not argue with him, because sometimes the right response to someone arriving late is simply to let them in. Patricia left on a Friday morning. Daniel carried her suitcases to her car. I stood at the front door and I said goodbye, and I meant it without hostility, because hostility serves no one, and I was finished performing emotions I did not feel. She looked at me before she got in the car with an expression I have thought about many times since. Not cruelty, not defeat exactly, something closer to recalibration. The expression of a woman who had operated for a long time under a specific set of assumptions and had encountered evidence that those assumptions needed updating. She did not apologize. I did not expect her to. She got in her car and she drove away, and I stood at the door until the car turned the corner, and then I went inside and I stood in the hallway for a moment and felt the house settle back into itself. The coat was gone from the hook, the shoes were gone from the mat, the bedroom was ours again. I walked upstairs and I stood in the doorway of our room, and the linen was ours, and the nightstand was clear, and the space on my side of the room was empty in the way that a space is empty when it belongs to you and no one else. Daniel came up behind me and stood in the doorway beside me, and neither of us said anything for a moment. Then he said, "I am sorry it took me this long." I said, "I know." He said, "I mean it." I said, "I know that too." And then I walked into the room and I started unpacking properly for the first time since we had come home.
The weeks after Patricia left were not immediately easy, and I want to be honest about that, because this is not a story where everything resolves cleanly the moment the difficult person exits the frame. Daniel had spent 30 years learning a particular way of relating to his mother, and unlearning it was not a process that completed itself in 10 days. There were moments in the months that followed where his first instinct was still the old one, the phone ringing and his posture changing before he had even looked at the screen, the automatic "I will take care of it" before I had been consulted, the small reflexive accommodations that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with a pattern that ran deeper than our marriage because it predated our marriage by decades. I noticed these moments, and I named them when they mattered, and I let the smaller ones go, because choosing every battle is not wisdom, it is exhaustion dressed up as principle. What changed was that Daniel noticed them too. He started catching himself. He started checking in with me before committing to things that affected both of us. He started, slowly and imperfectly, and with genuine effort, learning the difference between honoring his mother and being governed by her. That difference is not nothing. That difference is the whole thing. We went back to Portugal the following spring, not because we needed to fix anything, because we had wanted to go back since the moment we left, and because the trip the first time had been interrupted by something that no longer had the same hold on our life.
We went to Lisbon, and we went to the Algarve, and we sat on a terrace above the ocean, and Daniel's phone did not come out of his pocket for the entire evening, and I noticed that, and I did not say anything about it, because some things are better received when you let them land quietly rather than announcing them. Patricia and I found a version of a relationship that worked, which is not the same as a warm one and is not pretending to be. She calls Daniel on Sundays, and he calls her back when he is ready, not in the middle of whatever we are doing, not in the first 30 seconds after his phone lights up. She came to dinner twice in the months after she left, and both times she sat at the table in my house as a guest, which is what she is, and I was a good host, which is what I choose to be. Not because she earned it, because I decided that how I behave in my home is mine to determine, and I would rather be the person I want to be than spend energy performing resentment that no longer serves me. That was my choice. It took me longer than I would like to admit to arrive at it. My name is Sera Whitfield, and I was 31 years old when I came home from my honeymoon to find my mother-in-law in my bed and my marriage already being tested in ways I had not prepared for. I am 32 now, and I am sitting in the house that is mine, that smells like the cleaning product I choose, where the coat on the hook is mine, and the shoes on the mat are mine, and my husband's, and where the bedroom at the end of the hall has linen I picked, and a nightstand that is clear, and a pillow with nothing on it that does not belong there. Daniel is in the kitchen making coffee the way he makes it on Saturday mornings, slowly, without rushing, the way he does things when he is not managing anyone's emergency but his own morning. We have not solved everything. I do not think marriage is a problem that gets solved. I think it is a thing you maintain, the way you maintain anything that matters, with attention and honesty, and the willingness to see the difficult thing before it becomes the unbearable thing. What I know is that my husband chose me. It took longer than it should have, and it cost more than it needed to, and I wish some of it had been different, but he chose me, and I chose to let that matter. If there is someone in your life who is waiting to see if the person they married will show up for them when it is genuinely hard, I want you to hear me. Make the moment visible, make the choice necessary, and then wait to see who they actually are when the cost of both options is clear. That is my story. If it stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.